And welcome back to SIHH Live. During the week in this TV studio, we're going to welcome and listen to some of the people who are at the core of fine watchmaking and their ideas. And today, this session, we're going to talk about watches auctions with Aurel Bacs. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. He's a co-founder of Bacs and Russo, which advises collectors, museums, and brands, but he's also a senior consultant with the Phillips auction house. And I'm very pleased to have him here because there's a lot to be said about a booming market. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Please take a seat. I would like to start from three numbers. 26, 12, and 17. 26 is, of course, 26th of October last year when you auctioned in New York a very special, very particular Rolex watch. It was part of this exhibit here by Phillips, iconic watches. There was a very intense bidding, and after roughly 12 minutes, you knocked it down for $17.8 million, including the buyer's premium, needs to be precise, which makes it the most expensive watch ever sold at an auction. Congratulations first.
Thank you, Bruno.
It's this watch here. You have described it as the Adam and Eve of watch collecting. Tell us about it.
So let's go back maybe some 30, 40 years. The Rolex sports line, sports watches, were tool watches. Not particularly costly compared to what we call HORLOGERIE from GENÈVE with hand-finished movements. These were truly used by scientists, race drivers, people in laboratories, adventurers. That's the whole Rolex campaign around these pieces. The toughest watch to sell back then was the Rolex Daytona, which is hard to imagine today when the hottest thing to get jumping the waiting list is a Rolex Daytona. But Paul Newman, who turned a film in 1968 with his wife, John Woodward, Winning, great movie if you haven't seen
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
And he discovered racing then. He was an actor, but it was the first time, according to his daughter, that he drove himself a car in excess of 60 miles an hour, which is sort of top speed on a highway.
Yeah.
He really got the bug, and on the occasion of that movie, John Woodward offered him this very watch. It says on the back, "Drive carefully, me," because he really pushed it to the limits. He became very competitive.
He became a great driver, actually.
And he became really a very accomplished and very competitive race driver. That watch was photographed on his wrist for about 15 years. And in the 80s, first in Italy, then in America, people said, wow, Newman is cool, the watch on his wrist is cool. And this is how an entire movement of watch collecting started. People always collected watches. The great Patek Phillips, the Vacheron Constantin, the Cartiers, clocks, pendulettes. But steel Rolex, totally out of the world. And with him, the watch became iconic. Thanks to him, this dial version is now called the Paul Newman. And with that watch, everything else steel in Rolex, Submariner, Sea Dweller, Explorer, Milgauss, became equally collectible. And with all these watches, everything sports. We have the Polaris from Jaeger-LeCoultre, the Ingenieur from IWC, we have the 55 from Blancpain. It's an entire movement that is now really popular, that tool watch segment. And so this is why I called the watch Adam and Eve. It's at the very beginning of a trend that we see today at the SIHH.
So, as you mentioned before, this is actually not a particularly special watch from the perspective of watchmaking. It's a rather normal chronograph.
It's a reference 6239, stainless steel chronograph with a Valjoux 72 movement that without the history you would acquire today at an auction for maybe $150,000 to $200,000.
Yeah.
Back then, you got even a discount for that watch, so hard it was to sell it.
But so clearly the value of it is the history it carries, you know? And there is a whole legend about how Paul Newman offered it to the boyfriend of his daughter, and there is this nice quote about it keeps a quite good time if you
correct
wind it and wind it, and so What criteria go into defining the value of a watch you sell at an auction today? Are there any objective criteria? I mean, every piece is unique, of course, but...
Yeah, so in my view, a watch auction, or any auction, probably also in art for rare collectors' cars, makes only sense when you propose an item that is so rare that it is difficult to find a perfect clone, I mean an identical item, elsewhere. Otherwise, why bidding on it? Example, if I put up my smartphone for auction, why would somebody pay anything above a precise value? Because you can buy as many as you want the next day. This is clearly not the case here, so rarity is the starting point to make an object auction worthy. Rarity is one thing. Now there's also beaten up, terrible, ugly watches that are very rare and still nobody wants them. So there are more parameters that go into this. I would still like to start with the name of the manufacturer. Now we can say this is very unfair, like those who say, I don't care what's inside the bottle, I just look at the label. We should look at what's inside first. But it is true that a great name has a starting point. Picasso, Modigliani in art, and of course the famous names in watches. Then I would look at the complications. More is more. We cannot deny that a chronograph, a perpetual calendar, a repeater, a tourbillon gives a collector that extra envie, that desire to own it. I think then is condition and originality very important. These watches were back then not made as collector's items. These were high-end items for an elite of connoisseurs, but they were not collectibles, they were used. As a consequence, it is very understandable that these watches were here and there a little ding, a scratch, maybe by coincidence it fell into the water. They had to be serviced, pieces were replaced, it was cleaned, and that has, with time, of course, an impact on how it is preserved today. So the lesser wear, the lesser exchanged parts, the lesser things were altered, the more popular. We can call this the quality, the originality, the authenticity, the rarity, because unique pieces are really rare. I mean, by definition, no pun intended, but the watches were made back then in maybe a few dozens, a few hundreds, a few thousands. The rarity is not just how many were made, but also how many of those survived and how many of those survived in collector-worthy condition. So the entire market is driven by supply and demand. And as we can see here with the Paul Newman, provenance. It's not just did it belong to Paul Newman or Winston Churchill or to Jackie Kennedy, recently a Cartier. It's also, does it come from the first owner, the second owner? Has it been in a distinguished collection? So we also like to value the past of the watch, where it has been in the last few decades.
So let's see about that and this watch, because there are legends about this watch. At a certain point, he was even not sure whether it still existed. We had the pictures of Newman wearing it in the car, outside of the car, but it wasn't clear whether it still existed. How did you find it, or how did it come to you?
It's a little bit embarrassing to admit. I didn't find the watch. I knew of the watch, obviously, since we all know it, since the 1980s, with the magazines, the photographs. I really never went to look for it, because I simply thought I will just never find it.
But others were doing so, collectors.
I know some tried, some got really close, and I admit I never tried. Simply thinking it's a waste of time. It's lost love. And then I receive a phone call one day where I'm offered this watch, announced that it is available. My first instinctive reaction to myself was, this is possibly a hoax. This is possibly once again somebody thinking he has it, but it's not going to be the real thing. But given the admiration I have for Paul Newman, given the, of course, prestige, the value of this watch, I did not want to take a gamble. Flew to California, met with James Cox, the former boyfriend of Nell Newman, and had to realize on the spot that this is the one and only, totally legitimate, flawlessly provable piece that the whole world was looking for.
Let's talk a moment about the shape of the market, because the watch auction market is really growing. What are the key trends you see today in the vintage watch market?
I think the predominant trend that I have seen in the last decade, and it's just becoming stronger and stronger every year, is quality and originality. We live in a world where, of course, the value of money seems to be going down daily. It's not just the inflation that we can quantify by a % or two, but it's simply that so much new wealth is created. There is so much appetite for art, collectibles, that these collectors who even started just a year or two ago, they go straight to the top. Everybody goes to the top. Therefore, this pyramid, that is the supply of all watches, at the bottom, very wide, lots of watches that really nobody needs for a particular reason. Nice to have, but nothing of historical quality. And the more we go up on the quality, rarity, beauty, historic scale, the more the giants, the super collectors with deep pockets, lots of passion, clash. And therefore, the trend of quality overall is, I think, the predominant trend. We see, and that's something I very much welcome, a new trend going sideways. It used to be, and obviously to those who read the headlines, it's a game between Rolex, Patek Philippe, and the biggest names in the world. But thankfully, we see today collectors looking for a niche that has not yet been discovered, that gives them a similar amount of satisfaction and pleasure in collecting. And that means that our market is actually broadening. Another trend I see is that we're eventually coming back to reasonable human sizes. I believe that these years where we were close to reach 50 millimeters diameter, we're now coming down towards 40, and in many, many ways already below 40. I also think that the wearer's comfort versus the show-off effect, that's a child from the noughties. We're now on a detox in regards to that. I think that's wonderful. We see also here at the SIHH many watches at more human sizes. Also ultra thin is again a trend, and that reflects also in vintage.
Who is buying? People say, oh, everything goes to China in a very dismissive way. Who's buying at auctions?
We have today, thankfully, an extremely well-balanced audience. Roughly at a Phillips auction, we see 40 nations competing. Now, 40 nations is what I just did. But sit down for a moment, take a piece of paper and a pen, and write down 40 country names. It's actually quite a remarkable number. You obviously bring out the first 20 European countries that come to your mind, North America, Canada, US, and then you go to Asia, and somewhere in the 30s you start having problems to even find new countries where you expect watch collectors to come from. This is, in my view, good because it means that we are not dominated by one group, geographical group or group in general of collectors. Makes the market more stable, less exposed to fluctuations. I remember a few years ago when the tragic accident occurred in Japan, the nuclear power station. For about that season or the next one, we didn't have any Japanese buyers or sellers. Japan is still a very important market, but it only represents about 1 or 2% at auction, and therefore it was business as usual. That's very good. It shows there is stability. Asia is probably the fastest growing market, but by far not yet a dominating market compared to Europe and the US. And within Asia, China is only one of several markets. Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, Taiwan are doing absolutely fantastically well.
When you have a successful or even spectacular auction of a watch, what kind of impact does that have on the brand today? What kind of impact does the desirability of the vintage watches have on the brand today?
First of all, I think it's a question you should ask the CEOs present here
yes.
at the SIHH. As far as I can see, today the auction market and the modern manufacturing market are growing together. I think 20 or so years ago, when I held the gavel for the first time in my life, there was clearly a disconnect. It was the manufacturers and then those nerds and weird collectors out there. There was very little interaction. Today, I'm delighted to see how all manufacturers embrace their past, their history, their heritage. I see how they treat their DNA every year more respectfully than in the previous years. They clearly do re-editions of vintage models to celebrate an anniversary. I saw the Paul Weber today at IWC. I see a new tank at Cartier, new in terms of a new launch, but a vintage design. I see how Jaeger-LeCoultre did a fantastic job with the Polaris. Every year I see how vintage and contemporary grow together. So, to me, it's natural.
So Mr. Benamias from Audemars Piguet was here yesterday, and he said actually that it seemed to indicate that definitely one of the strategic goals is to reunite those two markets, is to go back to all the watches that were sold before and basically bring them into the fold in a way, all the owners of those watches.
I mean, Audemars Piguet has always done an exceptional job. They have, since a very early stage, invested into a museum, into a collection. There are publications. They further invested in their heritage department by appointing historians and curators. They launched regular series of books dedicated to vintage perpetual candles, vintage repeaters. How can you love something and understand something if you don't even know it? And this kind of communication is very important to explain how did we get here where we are today. Otherwise you are either like a smartphone company or a Tesla that says we start from scratch, here we are, fair enough, there's nothing wrong with that, but here we are celebrating history and tradition.
Absolutely.
And you need to explain how you got here. And Audemars, I have to say, does a fabulous job.
I'm going to ask the team to put up the slide about how to ask questions online, but I have a couple of questions that maybe are a bit delicate because they're about money. You mentioned before that money is becoming cheaper, meaning it's more available in a way, and it has an impact on the structure of the market. Some people have actually criticized the Newman Daytona auction price as immoral. And of course, there have been many steps towards that. There have been other auctions that were multi-million-dollar auctions. What do you respond to that kind of criticism?
It's a very good question, and clearly one that I sometimes wonder myself when I wake up in the morning, what is reasonable and what is normal? It probably would be too easy for me to say, well, I don't have a problem with that because it's the bidders who make the price and not me. That would be too easy. When I see an $18 million Rolex chronograph, then on one hand, of course, we can think how much charitable work I could do. But at the same time, I know also how much charitable work the buyer actually of that watch already does. I also know that some of the proceeds of that watch are going into the Newman Foundation for sustainable food, nature, environment. So I sleep very well. At the same time, I have to compare such a result with a price achieved for a Leonardo da Vinci painting that I'm sure you saw in the press, $450 million, We know that a top collector's car is now easily going at $50 million or more, diamonds at $100 million or more. We know of real estate at 100 million, and I'm talking about single homes, not big
$300 million castles in France.
Castles. Yes. I think I said it before, the value of money is very different than what it used to be. When I was a child, my grandfather told me a millionaire can live for the rest of his life with the $1,000,000 francs in the bank purely from the interest. Try to do that today. You can't even camp in the outskirts of Geneva with the revenues of your million. So we are in a globalized world where probably the number of billionaires competing in the art market has doubled, tripled, quadrupled in the last decade with India, China, Central and South America. It's part of the new reality, and I don't think yet we're at the end of this journey.
One last question about money, and is about the commissions that auction houses take. Used to be 5 to 10%, and now it's up to 25%, I understand. Does that pay for your team flying private jets? What is that about?
Well, that's a very nice thought, and I should recommend all auction house owners to offer private jets to their staff. The truth is twofold. On one hand, it used to be 10%. I think 5% must have been at Julius Caesar's times.
Okay.
It used to be 10% in the 70s, as far as I can remember, and has gradually grown. At the same time, the seller's commission has come down. So it's basically just moving the posts towards the buyer. But at the end of the day, the transaction is the same for everyone. Yep. What I also see is how the cost structure in the auction industry has changed radically. Auction houses used to print something like is it called A5? The small sort of notepad size catalogs, maybe with a short description, at best with a black and white picture. The viewing was simply come and raise your paddle, sold as is. If you saw today's auction catalogs, the scholarship and the hard work that goes into this, the expectations and services that clients have towards auction houses, I think it would be quite fair to say that an auction house today is not more profitable than it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, I will not name the person, an auction house shareholder once said, and I think he quoted Richard Branson, there's a absolutely safe bet how to become a millionaire. What is it? Start as a billionaire and go into the auction house industry.
That's probably something that was true in the past. I'm not sure it's still...
The last point, but now being serious about this, is the auction industry was predominantly in London, New York, at most 30, 40 years ago, then to Geneva, then to Germany, then to Spain. Today, the globalization requires a presence in 5 continents, in 20, 30, 40, 50 or more cities. No one could have ever expanded to really establish a worldwide presence without having a bit of a profit that would be used to invest into the growth.
Let's talk a moment about authenticity. So when we last spoke, you told me that when you started, there were barely a couple of books that you could read to learn about watches and the history of watches. Now, of course, we have not only full libraries, but the whole internet and way more. We're going to talk about the internet in a second, but when somebody calls you and says, like they did with this watch, I have a piece that may be of interest to you, what are the first questions that run through your mind? How do you approach that?
Well, the first question we have to ask ourselves is it a watch that is potentially worth to be auctioned? If we already see that it's a very pretty, fun watch, but for maybe 500 francs, we kindly inform the owner that this is not worth following up. Yep. But let's say it could be a $50,000 collector's piece that was found by a hair in the drawer of the late grandmother. We then first communicate by photographs to establish a little bit the condition, a little bit the overall quality of the piece. Once this is done, we connect the nearest Phillips specialist with the owner. If the owner is in Florida, then the New York team takes over. We ask for movement case numbers that allows us already to go and check in the archives of the manufacturer, does it actually make sense? We then, sooner or later, have a personal one-to-one meeting with the owner, where the specialist does a first examination, a little bit like a patient in the hospital, first check, second check, laboratory, blood test. And if everything looks good by then, and both the auction specialist and the owner are in agreement what should be the plan of action, then the piece comes to Phillips. It comes to Phillips with the aim of being auctioned, but then the real hard work starts. We cannot take the watch apart in front of the client. We do that in our workshop where we have a qualified watchmaker. We then do several tests. We have to check the quality of the movement. We have to take the dial off and look from both sides. Has it been restored? Has it been altered? We obtain certificates from the manufacturers who don't just give them over the phone like here you are. It needs photographs and in some instances even the physical watch in Geneva at their workshops. We then show the watch to outside specialists, especially our advisory board, composed of several world-renowned scholars. And only if all these exams have been successfully passed, the watch makes it into the auction catalog.
And there was a time when a watch that had been repaired and had some components changed was still considered authentic, and now we're becoming more stringent about that, right?
We become more and more stringent. In one way I find it good. I do start seeing a trend that I think is unhealthy. Basically, a watch that a pusher has been changed, no. It seems like it has a disease, like
polluted. Yeah.
It's polluted. We have to come to terms with the fact that these are 20, 50, or 80-year-old watches. And what's wrong if in 1960 the watch went to the manufacturer and the manufacturer saved the watch by putting a new pusher on? What is more important to me is not the fact if the pusher is right or maybe a little later, is that the auction house informs the buyer that this is a pusher that is maybe 20 or 30 years younger than the watch, so that the buyer knows what he's bidding on. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, we can just close down everything because there's not that many brand new, never worn, 0 kilometer on the meter watches out there.
You mentioned the manufacturers taking a look at the watch and certifying, etc. Not all manufacturers do that, though. Some of them don't play in this game.
We have pretty much from 0 involvement to 100% involvement, we have everything. Some manufacturers simply don't want to or cannot enter into the authentication process. And some manufacturers are really hands-on and want to see the piece in their own workshops. And then you've got a lot of gray in between. I'm welcoming all manufacturers who do provide a service because it is as much in their interest as in our interest to really assess the piece as precisely as possible so that when it comes to the auction, that every bidder knows what they're bidding on.
Allow me just to tell the team that they're going to go a few minutes over time because I want to see if there are any questions from people who are sitting here in the studio, and I also have a few more questions for you. So if anyone wants to ask a question to Aurel Bacs, please just raise your hand, and yes, one here. The microphone is coming for you. Yeah.
Certainly you mostly deal with the watches with history, but when you come to the watch fairs like SIHH, what makes you excited the most?
I come for, first of all, thank you for asking that question. I come to the SIHH for a multiple number of reasons. Every brand today is, as I said, more and more embracing their past, their history. I connect with museum directors. What's the latest on the market? What pieces are you looking for? I also admire and study the new launches, because whatever is produced today will be vintage in 20 or 30 years ago. And that gives me an idea where the industry is heading overall. It's also a fantastic opportunity to connect with collectors who come maybe only 2 or 3 times to Switzerland every year from all over the world. The press, I cannot make 50 meters in the corridors without shaking 50 hands and finding 50 opportunities to engage with a lady or a gentleman in front of me.
Any other question? Yes, one here, one there. Sir, first. Can we get, wait for the microphone so that people can hear you online. There we go. Okay, so you go first and then we come back to you. Please.
Daniel Hock from NZZ am Sonntag in Zurich, Switzerland. Can you give us an estimate on volume, how large the collector's watch market is today and with what growth rate it goes along? And second question, how do you deal with companies that have no archive because the company closed down? For instance, if you have an old Jacques Guedreau from the 60s, you don't find any archives about this watch. Blancpain didn't exist for a long time. How do you go on when the company has no archive?
As the question is fresh, I will answer the second one first, if I may, and thank you for asking that question. There isn't just one way of researching a watch. I think it's called in English empiric research. That means you simply observe what is on the market. You don't know what the rule should be, but the rule is established by seeing 50 Jacques Guedreau from the 1960s. I'm not a Jacques Guedreau specialist for 1960s watches, but I know, and that's part of my job, to know who is and who has done that research. So if that collector has been collecting Jacques Guedreaus for 50 years, and he has, of each model, multiple examples from the 1959 model, the 1960 model, 1961 model, you start seeing how it should be, even if here and there a bezel, a glass, a pusher, a hand, a strap, or some parts were replaced. So purely observing what the manufacturers did back then gives you already a very good idea how the 11th piece should look like. That's one point. With companies that don't provide any service whatsoever, of course, we have to be more cautious because we know that there is no guarantee by a third party in terms of the authenticity and the legitimacy of the piece. That means we are all ourselves alone in saying yes or no to the piece. It makes it more difficult. Thankfully, it's the exception, but it's challenging. I completely agree. Your first question, how big is the collector's watch market? Let me ask you a question back. How do you define the collector's watch market? If somebody buys today here a $10,000 watch, is that a collector's watch? I guess so, because to tell the time, 49 francs at the airport in the tax-free is also good enough. So does it mean that the entire Swiss haute horlogerie is collector's market? Oh, vintage. So then the question is, where do you start counting vintage? 1980? 1970? Good. The vintage market, the way we just defined it, we see how much is going publicly at auction. You take the auction results from Phillips and the other major auction houses all together, and you come maybe to $200 million. I'm not Mr. Ackerman using the word peanuts, but it's a very small number compared to what the Swiss watch industry is all about. But then you have the transaction that we cannot observe and measure between watch dealers. In art, you would call them galleries. Let's call them watch galleries. Buying and selling, brokering sales of vintage watches. They don't publish the number, so we can just guess. That, let's say, will double, triple, quadruple that number. But then we have collector A selling his vintage watch to collector B. That means you would sell your watch to the gentleman next to you. Totally unknown to me. But because there are tens and tens of thousands of collectors doing that, and it's just the habit of collectors changing watches as often as I change my ties, that would probably again double that number. Where do we end up? We end up in the low billions. Can I prove it? No. Can you prove me the contrary? No. But it's a small fraction compared to what the Swiss watch industry produces every year. And it's also a small fraction of what pre-owned, and pre-owned is the opposite of vintage, that means watches from the 90s and the noughties are changing hands every year, because that is multi-times more than the vintage market.
There is one question here, and we're going to take that as the last question. Can you just raise your hand so I can see you?
Yes, hi. My question will be fairly short. As a collector, I'm wondering, why should I buy a watch from an auction house, such as yourself, rather than a dealer, a known dealer, someone who has a shop? What's the added value? I'll just add something. It's just that some watches, when they go at auction, I'm not talking about the Paul Newman or anything like that, you know, because that's a different story, obviously. But if you're buying a simple watch, I'd say an ordinary Rolex, you know, a classic reference 5513 or things like that, why buy something like that at auction rather than from a dealer where the prices might be a little more reasonable in some circumstances?
It's an excellent question. Why buying at an auction house instead of a good dealer? Personally, by the way, I have bought many watches from distinguished dealers, and there's absolutely nothing wrong. On the contrary, it's a very attractive alternative to auctions. When you buy at auction, let's say there's a watch that in your view is worth 10,000. Let's take a Submariner as you just suggested it. An auction house that does their job properly, they will offer the watch with a starting bid at 6,000 maybe. If you go to the auction and the watch is exactly as you saw it with the dealer at 10,000, well, you would be a fool not raising your paddle at 6,000. 6,000 plus buyer's premium, you're still way better off buying at auction. Now, it might get tricky when you start getting carried away and you bid 12,000, 50,000, 20,000. That may be different. I said it at the beginning. It's an auction house's job to find watches that you cannot find that easily elsewhere. Hence, I'm no longer competing on price with the dealer. I'm offering you the one and only, and you either take it or leave it. Meaning, nobody can say, oh, you were such a fool to overpay. You could have bought the same elsewhere for less. Lastly, the auction house is offering, I think, a service that is second to none. Before we publish the catalog, we do the research that I just mentioned. Then you get a catalog that you can discuss with any friend online, offline, for at least 4 weeks before the auction. I don't know that many dealers who send to your home a paper copy of a catalog and who publish their inventory completely online. Then we start touring the highlights of the auction. We go to Asia, we go to London, we go to the United States. That means that if you're in Connecticut and the auction is in Geneva, you don't have to come to Geneva to look at the watch. We bring it basically to the Big Apple in front of you. You can come with your watchmaker, and you can come with 3 friends from that particular collector's area. You can look at the watch, you can open the watch, you can speak to a specialist. At the same time, every single watch that we offer will be discussed at length on every collector's forum, pointing out, oh, did you see, still has the original hands. Oh, did you see, that has never been polished. Meaning, you're not alone in front of the other party, trying to get as much as possible, and you try to buy it as attractively priced as possible. And that gives you a degree of comfort that by the time you raise your paddle, you were able to assure yourself, with all your knowledge and friends and scholarship and discussion forums, that what you're really bidding on is what you're after eventually. And then, yes, of course, it takes a little bit of discipline to go as far as you can, but not beyond.
Mr. Bacs, thank you for taking us inside the auction world. It's clearly more complex than just a gavel and a price. Thank you for coming to SIHH Live.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And thank you all you for coming. The next session is going to be at 3:30 p.m. and it's going to feature a presentation by Maison Cartier. See you later. Thank you.